I ran across the parking lot behind Bellini's as the cold rain hammered down like needles piercing my skin. My thin uniform soaked through in seconds and clinging to me like a second, icy, humiliating layer. The late shift had been brutal. 12 hours on my feet without rest, serving impatient diners with impossible demands, all for $60 in tips that barely made a dent in the mountain of medical bills waiting at home. I fumbled for my keys inside the torn strap bag at my side, the flickering amber glow of the street lamp stretching my shadow across the cracked pavement, long and distorted, like the warped outline of my own life. Most employees parked in the back lot where it was darker, farther, and certainly no safer. Bellini's was built for people with expensive watches and tailored suits, people who never once turned their heads to look at someone like me. To them, I was a shadow, a ghost who delivered menus and disappeared, someone who wiped down tables while they discussed big deals that would never touch my world. A car door slammed behind me, the sound echoing through the cold, wet night. I froze, every muscle taut, my heart pounding hard enough that I felt it in my ears. I realized I was completely alone, no witnesses, no one who would hear me scream. Working the late shift in this neighborhood had never been smart, especially not for a woman. But when you are a 28-year-old single mother with a 5-year-old daughter waiting at home with an elderly neighbor and diabetes bills that arrive faster than autumn leaves fall, smart choices are a luxury you rarely have. I tried to force the key into the lock, my numb fingers trembling so hard that even simple movements failed me. "Please, open," I whispered through clenched teeth. A sharp explosion cracked the air like lightning splitting the sky, and I dropped to the ground instinctively, the keys flying from my hand and skittering across the wet pavement. My heartbeat ricocheted inside, my ribs, my breathing jagged as rain pounded onto my back like shards of ice. Then came 3 more shots, rapid and precise, the kind fired by someone whose hand never wavered. A man shouted, urgent and razor-sharp. I should have crawled under the car, hidden, done anything to make myself invisible. That is what wiser people would have done, but I had never been wise. Instead, I lifted my head and peered past the wheel well, trying to understand the chaos. Around 20 meters ahead, near the employee entrance, 4 black SUVs were parked close together, their doors flung open, interior lights glowing faintly through the rain. Dark-clad figures moved with the swift precision of dancers in a deadly tango, and then I saw him. Amid all the chaos, he stood completely still, a tall figure with broad shoulders, his long coat thrown open to reveal a fitted, impossibly expensive suit beneath. The streetlight caught the angle of his face, the defined jaw, the straight nose, the deep black eyes, the neatly cut hair, his expression disturbingly calm despite the gunfire, the shouting, the blood. I recognized him instantly. Everyone at Bellini's knew Julian Rios. He came in maybe once a month, not often but always with the kind of presence that made the entire restaurant hold its breath. The manager served him personally. The chef cooked dishes that never appeared on the menu, and the staff whispered warnings to one another not to stare, not to speak unless spoken to, not to draw attention. People said he owned half the city, though no one ever specified which half. I always assumed it was the half lit in danger. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time, and one of the men guarding him collapsed. More shadows moved along the wall, weapons drawn, closing in, an ambush. "Get him in the car now," someone yelled. The guards formed a shield around Julian, trying to push him toward the nearest SUV, but they were too exposed under the rain of bullets. Another man went down. The number of protectors dwindled. I should have stayed down, kept my head low, prayed for it to end without pulling me into it. Lena needed me alive, not brave. My daughter needed me to walk through the front door each night, not be carried into a morgue. But something flickered in Julian's eyes as he looked at the man who had just fallen, a flash of pain that contradicted every rumor I had ever heard about him. And then he looked up. His eyes met mine. Recognition. He remembered me. I was the waitress who had spilled water on his girlfriend during his last visit, stammering apologies while he studied me with an expression that had been equal parts amused and unreadable. In that moment, a tiny red dot appeared on his chest. I did not think. I did not weigh my options. I simply moved. Maybe I was too tired of watching people die for nothing. Maybe because, despite everything whispered about Julian Rios, no one deserved to be shot down in a rain-soaked parking lot like that. Or maybe I was just following the reckless instinct that had led me through a lifetime of questionable choices. I surged to my feet and ran. My shoes slipped on the slick pavement, my heart drumming like a war beat. Someone shouted, maybe a warning, maybe a curse, I could not tell. I slammed into Julian just as the shot fired. The impact sent both of us to the ground. A searing pain tore through my left shoulder, hot and brutal. The world tilted. The pavement rushed toward me, but strong arms caught me before I hit the ground. Through the haze of pain I saw his face, no longer cold but stunned, and maybe angry. He said something, his voice sounding like it was underwater. Why did you do that? I tried to answer, but my lips would not form words. My vision dimmed. Outside, gunfire still sliced through the night. Orders were being shouted. And the last thing I heard was a low whisper against my ear, carried on the scent of rain and expensive cologne. Do not die for me, do you hear? Do not die for me. Then everything went black. If Maya and Julian's story made your heart race in the storm of bullets, or simply made you pause and take a deeper breath, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it so you can follow me into the next chapters where danger and longing walk side by side. And where are you watching from? Leave a comment below so I know which city or country this journey has reached. I always want to know how my story has found its way to your heart. I woke to the unfamiliar scent of expensive cologne and the soft luxury of pressed sheets that felt like brushed velvet against my skin. A high white ceiling hovered above me, warm golden light spilling from a chandelier so gently that for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. But the throbbing ache in my left shoulder dragged me back to reality with cruel clarity. I shifted slightly and bit down hard to stifle a cry. A firm white bandage wrapped my shoulder, tight and meticulously placed. Everything in the room was impossibly quiet. No medical machines, no footsteps of nurses, no sharp scent of disinfectant like the public hospital I had taken Lena to so many times. Instead, the air felt private, immaculate, almost foreign in its elegance. I lay on a bed far too large for any normal person's needs. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened to a view of the city so high that the buildings below looked like miniature models. A door opened and he stepped inside. Julian Rios. His white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his tie loosened at the collar, his expression stripped of the usual cool detachment and replaced by something more serious, harder to read. He stopped beside the bed, hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over me like he was assessing damage. You are awake. His voice was low, steady, tinted with an authority no one would dare question. I turned toward him and instinctively tried to sit up, but a sharp bolt of pain made me hiss. Do not, he said, taking a half step forward as, if to help before stopping himself, his eyes fixed on me. You will tear the stitches if you push yourself. I nodded, biting my lip. Lena, I gasped softly. Where is she? Safe, Julian replied. Mrs. Whitaker has been informed you were injured at work and need medical observation for a few days. Lena is being cared for. She is fine. I had no idea how he obtained that information, but the fact that he knew my neighbor's name sent a shiver through me. How did you know? I started, but Julian cut me off with a look. I make it a habit to know the people who save my life. Maya Brooks, 28, widow. Husband killed in a work accident 3 years ago. A 5-year-old daughter with type 1 diabetes. 2 jobs, mornings at a daycare center, evenings at Bellini's, 6 days a week. Income insufficient for expenses. He recited it as if reading from a dossier. Heat pricked at my eyes as I clutched the edge of the blanket, anger and humiliation twisting together. You dug through my life. I do. Not need your pity, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Not pity. Debt, Julian answered, his gaze never wavering. You ran into gunfire for me with nothing to gain. You could have died. I cannot overlook that. I looked at him, my thoughts tangled and raw. I did not do it for you. I only did not want to watch someone die right in front of me, especially someone who clearly was not prepared to let go easily. And Julian gave a slight nod without arguing, murmuring almost to himself that no one deserved to be executed in a parking lot, his voice low, as if thinking aloud, and the air between us seemed to settle into something heavy, as I wondered whether this was the first time he had been confronted with an action he could not predict or control, the room suddenly feeling too quiet, until I broke the silence by saying I wanted to call Lena, that I needed to hear my daughter's voice, and Julian pulled a small, brand new phone from his pocket, telling me it was activated, that I could call Mrs. Whitaker, that the number was saved, and that Lena was coloring pictures, completely unaware of what had happened. And when I took the phone with my right hand, my palm was still trembling as I asked how long he intended to keep me here, fighting off another wave of dizziness. And he answered without hesitation that I would stay until he was certain no one could threaten me or my child, which made me shake my head in weary disbelief because I could not stay here forever. I had work. I had a little girl who needed me. And Julian stepped closer, his eyes sharpening as he said, "Maya, you saved my life. You are not my employee. You are a mother who threw herself between me and a gunman, which means that to the men who ordered the attack, you are now a threat. You are no longer invisible." And his words chilled me so deeply that I looked out the window at the city, glowing like a wide golden tapestry, and realized I had stepped into a world where I did not belong, and the frightening part was that there was no way back anymore. And I did not remember drifting to sleep, but when I opened my eyes again, the light outside had softened into a pale orange glow of sunset. The phone Julian had given me sitting on the bedside table with the screen lit as if someone had just checked it, and when I touched it, a message appeared from an unknown number that was not difficult to guess, saying, "Your daughter has had dinner. Slept well this afternoon. Everything is fine." And I read that line again and again, as though it were the last fragile thread connecting me to the ordinary life I had just been pulled away from. And then the door opened again, and this time it was a woman dressed in a light gray suit, her hair neatly pinned up, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses, and I sat up too quickly, forgetting the pain in my shoulder as she greeted me calmly, saying, "Hello, Miss Brooks. I am Diana Cruz, Mr. Rios's personal assistant, and I am here to discuss a few necessary matters regarding the coming days." Her voice level and controlled without a hint of warmth, and before I could respond, she placed a stack of documents on the small table, including a treatment plan, a list of medications, a schedule for physical therapy, and a confidentiality agreement, which made me frown as I asked if she expected me to sign it, careful not to jolt my injured shoulder. And Diana nodded slightly, saying it was for my safety as well as the organization's, because I had witnessed something no one was meant to see, that I had saved the most powerful man in this city, and because of that I needed to understand that my life would no longer be what it once was, and I stared at the papers, feeling as though I were being swallowed by something far bigger than myself. As I said, I did not want to be entangled in their world, that I just wanted to return to my daughter. But Diana sat across from me, legs crossed, hands folded on her lap, and said I had no choice, that the men who attacked Mr. Rios were not the type to give up, that they would come for me sooner or later, and when they did, no one but him could protect me, and I gripped the blanket, furious and helpless, as I asked whether this was the cost of saving a life, whether I had become a hostage in his world, and she adjusted her glasses and replied that I was not a hostage. I was someone whose debt Mr. Rios would never take lightly, and that was why I was alive, why my daughter was safe, and why I was lying in a luxurious room rather than a crumbling shack waiting to die. And I stayed silent partly because she was right, and partly because I no longer knew how to respond, when everything around me felt controlled by someone else, like I had been wrapped inside a velvet-lined box that was beautiful but airtight with no exit. And when Diana rose to leave, she told me, Mr. Rios would visit me tonight and that I should prepare myself. And after she closed the door, I remained clutching the edge of the sheets, realizing that Julian Rios owed me a life. But I was beginning to understand that in his world debts were never simple, that nothing came without a price, that the rules were written in blood, silence, and unwavering loyalty, and the only question was how I was supposed to survive in a place I did not belong. But before I could even think of an answer, the door opened again and Julian entered without knocking, looking at me with eyes that no longer held cold distance but a kind of tiredness, as though he too was wrestling with the gravity of what had happened. And he asked if I knew what had surprised him most, and when I shook my head he stepped closer and said it was the fact that I was not afraid of him, that despite all the rumors, and despite seeing the violence that surrounded him, I had still thrown myself in front of him, not because of who he was, but because he was human. And I said nothing as he bent down and placed something on the bedside table, a small brown teddy, bare with a pale blue ribbon, the one Lena had mentioned, and he said he had arranged for it to be brought to me. And when I picked it up, my fingers trembled at the familiar softness as I asked whether he had spoken to my daughter, And he said only a little, that he had wanted to see whether the child of the woman who saved him had eyes like her mother. And he paused, looking straight at me, saying she did, and that he realized the debt between us was far larger than he had first imagined. And when daylight filtered in through the sheer cream curtains, spreading soft golden streaks across the wooden floor, it almost made me think I was waking in some beautiful dream, until the ache in my shoulder, the tiny teddy bear Julian had brought from Lena, and the heavy pressure in my chest reminded me that this was reality, a reality wrapped in velvet and glass, but filled with invisible rules I had not yet learned. And as I stepped slowly out of the room, bare feet on cool wooden floors, my right hand steadying my injured shoulder, I found the space outside the bedroom transformed into something entirely different, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, expensive modern furnishings arranged with a precision that left no room for coincidence. Everything so deliberate it reminded me of its owner, and a woman's voice floated from behind me, soft but unmistakably in control, asking whether I needed anything. Miss Brooks. And when I turned, it was Diana, who was not asking out of concern but to ensure I was not stepping beyond any boundary, and I said I only wanted to walk a little because the apartment was too quiet, and she nodded slightly, motioning for me to sit on the long gray sofa as a server appeared almost instantly with a cup of herbal tea, not needing to ask because they already knew what I preferred. And Diana sat across from me, still flawless, saying I had stepped into a system where everything functioned according to unwritten rules everyone was expected to understand, and I met her gaze and told her to explain what I had become involved in, and she nodded, saying Mr. Rios was not an ordinary businessman, that he controlled multiple economic sectors, both legitimate and unofficial, but that he had principles: no trafficking, no drugs, no harm to innocent women or children. And I let out a dry laugh, asking whether that made him a good man, and she did not blink as she answered no. But neither was he the villain I imagined, and above all he always repaid his debts. The golden law, a life for a life, a promise binding for as long as he breathed. And I sat quietly, my eyes drifting to the abstract paintings on the walls, because this apartment looked like a modern paradise, but beneath the glass and warm light was a cold world where every choice carried consequences. And Diana continued, saying I had two options: to stay here under absolute protection, or to leave and place both my life and my daughter's in danger because the men who attacked that night would not vanish after a failed attempt. They would try again, and I accused her of trying to frighten me. But she said she was telling me the truth, and that this was now the only safe place I had, and I did not answer, because all I could picture was Lena sleeping in an unfamiliar room, clutching the teddy bear as her only anchor in a world that had suddenly grown too large. And I knew I had to stay, at least until I was certain she was safe. And Diana stood, adjusting her sleeve, saying, Mr. Rios wished to dine with me tonight, which made me blink in disbelief. Dinner with me, and she simply nodded, adding that he was accustomed to obedience from everyone around him, but I was different because I had stood between life and death for a stranger, and that was something he could not take lightly. And when she left, I remained seated, staring through the mist-softened skyline, a cup of cooling tea in one hand and the other gripping the edge of the table, sensing that whatever this dinner meant, after tonight the line between Julian Rios and me would no longer be as simple as the boundary between the rescued and the rescuer, but something far more entangled, drawn together by rules etched in gold and glass, beautiful enough to chill the blood. I changed into the navy dress that had been hung in the closet for me, the cool, soft fabric gliding over my skin with such perfect precision that a shiver ran through me at the thought of someone choosing it according to my exact measurements. And I tied my hair back and added a touch of soft color to my lips, to hide the pallor left by days of exhaustion and pain, not to be beautiful, but to hold on to the last sliver of control I had in a world I had never chosen to enter. And when I stepped out of the room, Julian was already waiting by the tall window, his silhouette etched against the warm golden glow of the city below, wearing only a white shirt with no jacket, no tie, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows revealing tanned wrists and the faint trace of a tattoo along his left arm, looking less like the man I had seen surrounded by gunmen and more like an oddly ordinary human being. And he turned when he heard my footsteps and said, I looked better, his eyes moving quickly from my face to the bandaged wound on my shoulder, as I replied that it was surprising how surviving a bullet could give someone a radiant appearance. trying to lighten the tension, and he gave a faint smile, the first I had ever seen on him, however brief, before saying dinner was ready and gesturing toward the table set in the center of the living space near the large window. A dark wooden table arranged simply but beautifully, candles flickering in the quiet room, with no guards, no staff, no one standing watch, just the two of us. And when I sat down, I felt his gaze lingering, the dishes already prepared before I arrived, kept perfectly warm beneath silver covers, though I barely remembered what I ate, maybe seared salmon and a salad and warm bread, everything delicious enough that I found myself swallowing quickly, just to avoid meeting his eyes for too long, while he barely touched his food, mostly watching me, lifting his glass only occasionally, without looking away even for a moment, until he finally spoke, saying he once believed he understood people, understood loyalty and betrayal, understood when someone was afraid and when they pretended to be brave, but that when I ran into the gunfire he realized there were things about humanity he had never understood, and I told him again that I did not do it for him. I did it because I could not stand there and watch another person fall. And he nodded but said no one risked their life for a stranger unless they were different, his gaze burning into my skin, until I had to look away, because I did not want to become something rare or exceptional to him. I only wanted to live quietly, raise my daughter, work, pay bills, breathe like any ordinary person. And he replied with a steady voice asking whether I truly believed an ordinary woman would make him sit here sharing a private dinner in his own home. And when I asked whether this was his home, he nodded, saying the entire top floor belonged to him and that he brought me here because nowhere else was safe enough and when I asked because of what he said, because he could not take me anywhere else, that I had stepped into the center of the storm and he would not abandon someone who had saved his life. And I drew a deep breath and set my fork down and asked what he intended to do with me and how long he planned to keep me here, and he said until every danger had passed. And when I asked what if that danger never passed, he looked at me with a quiet weight and said he would protect me at any cost. And I did not know what answer I had been hoping for. Maybe a plan, maybe a guarantee. But instead, I received a promise without negotiation. A simple vow from a man powerful, enough to make the city kneel, yet somehow unable to let an anonymous woman bleed for him and walk away. And when dinner ended, he rose first and thanked me for staying, because not everyone would have dared to do that. And I nodded silently. And as he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway and said, "Maya, if you want to know the real reason I am here, perhaps the next dinner will be the right time." And then he disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone in the dimming candlelight with a heart full of unanswered questions. And I could not sleep afterward, because his final words replayed in my mind, like a soundtrack I could not turn off. "If you want to know the real reason I am here, perhaps the next dinner will be the right time." A sentence that carried no threat and no sweet invitation, only the sense of a missing piece in a puzzle I was not allowed to see all at once. And I wandered through the vast, silent apartment searching for something familiar, some anchor in this the world. But the warm golden lamps could not chase away the cold growing in my chest as I stood before the wall of glass looking down at the sleeping city. The faint scattered lights of distant windows reminding me of my old apartment, where Lena used to crawl into my bed whenever the rain fell hard. Memories that now felt as distant as a past life. And a small sound behind me made me turn sharply to see Julian standing there with his hands in his pockets, wearing a simple light gray sweater, instead of his usual button-down, looking unexpectedly human. And he apologized softly for startling me, saying he could not sleep, and I told him I could not either, and he stepped closer to stand beside me at the window, saying the city was beautiful at night but also the loneliest time. And I did not know why he said that to me, but I did not answer. And for a moment we shared a quiet stillness that felt like its own fragile language before he spoke again, asking if I had ever wondered how a man like him became the figure the entire city feared. And I glanced at him, remembering every rumor but never hearing the truth from his own mouth. And he said he would tell me tonight, not to excuse himself but so that I would understand. And he told me that his father had been Cuban and his mother Mexican, that they met in a working-class neighborhood in Philadelphia, his father a mechanic and his mother a seamstress, that they lived poor but honest until a protection racket began circling the shop and his father refused to pay, and 3 weeks later he was found in an alley beaten to death, and his mother, unable to bear the grief, died 6 months later of a cancer they could not afford to treat. And he paused without a tremor in his voice, though I saw his hand tighten slightly. And he said he had been only 14 years old with no one to protect him and no one to stand with him, and he vowed never to let anyone take what he loved without paying the price, and that from then on he learned to navigate a world without rules, and eventually wrote his own. And when he turned to me, his eyes held not cold darkness but a sorrow frozen solid by years of survival. As he said, he was not a good man, but had never allowed women or children to be pulled into what he did. That I was the exception, not because he wanted me to be, but because I had chosen to stand beside him when I should have run. And I did not know how to respond because I could not say I understood, nor could I forgive an entire system simply because he had once been a broken, orphaned boy. Yet I also could not deny that what shook me was seeing that behind the feared name whispered in restaurant hallways stood a human being, shaped by loss and twisted loyalty born from unbearable injustice. And I asked quietly why. If he could write his own rules, he chose a path of violence. And he said because sometimes to survive you could not afford to be gentle, and sometimes to protect what mattered, you had to become the pry-eyed, very thing you once hated. And I did not argue because deep down I knew I too had changed because of Lena, had done things the old version of myself would never have imagined, all to keep her safe and smiling. And in that moment I realized we were not as different as I once believed, that I was a mother trying to hold on to a home while he had been a son unable to save the home he loved, and so built a cold fortress to endure. And as he turned to leave, he paused and said he had never owed anyone anything as deeply as he owed me. And what frightened him was the fear that he might never repay that debt in the right way. And then he disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing before the glass, overwhelmed by thoughts of the man behind the power and the quiet fear that I too was changing in ways I had not yet recognized. The next morning I woke in the room, still carrying the faint, familiar scent of clean fabric and oak, sunlight filtering through the milk, white curtains and spreading, a soft golden wash across the ceiling, everything looking peaceful enough that I could almost convince myself the previous day had been a dream, until the dull ache in my shoulder, the small teddy bear lying beside my pillow, and the cold, empty space inside my chest reminded me that Lena was not here, and I sat up abruptly and walked straight out of the room toward what I assumed was Julian's office. The door unlocked. Julian standing with his back to me watching a large screen on the wall that displayed security footage. And on that screen I saw Lena sitting on the floor of a room overflowing with toys and drawings and star-shaped pillows, her hair tied into 2 small pigtails with pale blue ribbons, her pink dress fanned out like a tiny princess. And I realized she was not afraid at all, that she was smiling, the purest smile I had seen since months of hospitals and needles had taken so much of her childhood. And she held a crayon and scribbled across a large sheet of paper while, beside her, Mrs. Whitaker sat knitting, glancing over now and then to check on her. And Julian did not turn, but he knew I was there as he said he had ordered the room redesigned within 48 hours, that I had called it a castle. And I froze because he had heard my phone call with Lena the night before, when I had promised her that someday I would take her to live in a castle filled with colors and sunlight and safety, free of needles and doctors, a promise I knew I could never fulfill. And Julian turned toward me with an unreadable look and said he could not replace my promise, but he could give her something close to what she imagined. And I stepped closer, unable to tear my eyes from the screen because the room truly looked as though it had been drawn out of a child's storybook. Not luxurious in an adult sense, but in the way a child would create it with crayons and imagination. And I whispered that I did not know what to say, that he did not owe me this. And Julian frowned slightly and said he owed me far more than that, but that this was not about debt. This was because he knew too well the ache of losing a place to call home, and Lena needed a place like that. And I nodded faintly, feeling something vast shift quietly inside me. Not confusion, not anger anymore, but a gratitude so deep it frightened me, and I asked if I could go there, and Julian nodded, saying the car would take me today and that if I wished my daughter could stay with me there for a few days. And I turned to him because he was offering me something I had not dared to hope for in years. Not money or a house, but peace, a space not to hide but to live, and he left the room, leaving me alone with the image of my daughter drawing a sun in a deep yellow shade while humming a small song I could not hear. And I touched the screen as tears spilled before I could stop them, realizing I did not know who Julian Rios truly was beyond the name whispered across the city. But I knew one thing, that, whatever he had done or was still doing, that morning he had done something right, and that mattered more to me than anything else. The black car rolled quietly through the familiar streets with its dark, tinted windows blurring the view outside, though each turn and curve lived in my memory like the lines of my own palm, because this was the road that once led me home, though everything had changed now. And Lena sat beside me, clutching her teddy bear and her small pony-shaped backpack, saying little, only glancing up at me now and then as if to make sure I was still there, as if reassuring herself that her mother was not disappearing. And I stroked her hair and tried to smile despite the knot twisting inside me, while Mrs. Whitaker followed in another car, arranged to stay in a temporary apartment in the same secure complex Julian had set for me and Lena. And though he had handled everything with an almost unnerving thoroughness, it only tightened the unease in my chest because I knew too well that when someone could control everything down to the smallest detail, nothing truly belonged to you anymore. And the car stopped in front of the old apartment building where Lena and I had lived for 3 years, a weary block of concrete with weather-stained windows and rusted stairs leading up to the second floor. And I stepped out first, telling Lena to stay inside with Mrs. Whitaker, climbing the familiar steps to the door of the little unit that had once been our entire world. But the lock was new, not the one I had used, and when I knocked 3 times there was no answer. So I knocked harder, and after a pause, a man opened the door wearing a private security uniform, his face unfamiliar, his eyes detached, and I said my name, that this was my home, and he shook his head, saying the unit was no longer under my use, that the transfer had been processed and I should leave, and I froze, asking who had authorized it, insisting I had signed nothing and had not moved out. But he gave no explanation, simply closing the door in my face without apology, and I stood there stunned in the dim hallway where Lena's footsteps had echoed every morning, where I had hung a paper lantern last Christmas, now erased as if none of it had ever existed. And I walked back to the car, hiding my devastation behind a calm face, and Lena looked up at me with hopeful eyes, asking if we were home yet, and I swallowed my grief and nodded, telling her we were on our way to her castle, that her new room was home now. And she smiled and nodded and turned toward the window, and I watched her, my heart tightening because she was far too young to understand that some roads could never be retraced no matter how much we wished it. And as the car pulled away, I looked back one last time at the building that had once held our nights of fever, and whispered lullabies and colored paper taped to the walls, now a hollow shell with no soul left in it. And when we arrived at the complex Julian had assigned, Lena ran into her new room with a joy that broke my heart, touching every toy as if to memorize them, making sure they were real, and I sat alone in the living room staring out the window, knowing Julian had been right that I no longer had any other choice. But that truth brought no comfort, only a growing emptiness in my chest, as though I had lost something worth more than walls or rent, perhaps the right to choose, perhaps the illusion of freedom, or perhaps the sense that I was still living a life that belonged to me. And then my phone chimed with a message from an unsaved number saying, "A home is not a place, Maya. It is the person beside you, and the person you most want to protect is right now in the room next door." And I looked toward Lena's slightly open door where her nightlight cast a soft honey gold glow, and I did not respond, but I knew Julian was watching somehow, and for the first time I did not fear that. I only felt tired down to my bones, but within that exhaustion, a small part of me began to accept the truth that the home I once knew no longer existed, and that the place I was living now, though not chosen by me, was the only place where I could begin again, for my daughter, and perhaps one day, for myself. The third morning in the new apartment began with the soft, bubbling laughter of Lena drifting out from the colorful room she had already begun calling her castle, and I stood in the kitchen stirring eggs in a gleaming induction pan while the warm scent of coffee filled the air like a familiar note in a piece of music I had never heard before. Everything here so perfect, so quiet, so convenient that it felt as if I were living inside a glass box polished every day. Yet some leftover instinct inside me kept tapping a warning rhythm, the feeling that something was coming, vague like the flicker of a figure in a mirror just before you turn around. And then my phone vibrated with a message from Diana saying, "Do not leave the apartment today. There is unrest in the Western District. Julian will handle it. You and Lena are protected." And I read the message once, then again, my heart beating faster because unrest meant something was wrong, meant someone was hurt, meant gunfire, meant danger inching closer than safety could hold. And I stepped out of the kitchen, checking the doors and windows before locking everything tight, while Lena sat on the floor with her coloring book asking if she could draw a princess with purple hair, and I only nodded because I did not trust my voice to stay steady. Sitting beside her and resting my hand gently on her back, as if to reassure myself she was still here, still breathing, still whole. Sometime after 10, I heard a small sound at the door, faint but real, followed by 3 firm knocks, and I rose immediately, signaling for Lena to stay in her room. And through the peephole I saw a tall man dressed in black with no insignia, a stranger, and I did not open the door, but he spoke loud enough for me to hear through the crack, saying he was Tomas, one of Julian's men, and that they needed to take me somewhere safer. And when I asked, my voice tight as piano wire, what had happened, he said they knew I was here and they knew my daughter's name, and I unlocked the door only enough to look him in the eye and saw no lie there. Then turned and lifted Lena into my arms, her face puzzled and half asleep, and we took the elevator down to the basement, where a black SUV waited with Diana inside, her expression calm yet her white-knuckled grip on her phone betraying the stress beneath. And I asked how they knew, and she took a moment before saying they suspected someone inside their system had leaked information, that last night a strange car had parked near the building, its plates belonging to a company that had gone bankrupt 5 years ago. And when I asked if anyone had been hurt, she turned to me for the first time, showing the tiniest flicker of human and Aryan's fatigue as she said no, but they had left a message addressed to me, and she pulled a thick cream-colored envelope with slanted red ink reading, "To the brave, foolish mother," and I did not open it because my hands were shaking too hard. Lena now asleep in my lap, with the soft rise and fall of a child who knew nothing of what hunted us. And as I looked at her and out the window, I understood we were not running anymore. We were being hunted. When we reached the safe house outside the city, I carried Lena inside and was shown into a room with bulletproof doors stocked with supplies, clothes, food, toys, enough for days. And before leaving, Diana spoke a sentence that made my heart plunge into some depth without a bottom, saying, "Maya, this time, it is not only about Julian. They want you, and they will not stop." And I nodded, gripping my hands tight because there was no way back. No old home, no role of bystander left for me, because I had stepped into the battlefield and, whether I wanted to or not, I would have to learn to survive it, not just for myself but for Lena, for the little girl with yellow hair and eyes that believed every promise I ever made. And because I could not let another person decide where my story ended, I woke in the middle of the night with a jolt of dread as if something had brushed past my dreams. Lena still sleeping in my arms under a thin blanket that felt like a fragile shield between us and a world quietly collapsing outside. And though the room was still, the air felt heavier, and I sat up listening, hearing at last the alarm. Not a long howling siren like in movies, but a sharp, cold sequence of beeps slicing through the silence like a blade, and I jumped to my feet, pulling Lena close, her eyes fluttering open as she sensed the terror in the rhythm of my heartbeat. And then the faint scent reached me, the smell of burning, melted plastic and heated wood, and the door burst open with Tomas standing there covered in dust and smoke shouting that we had to go immediately, that the penthouse was on fire and the attack had come from outside, and I did not waste a second. My mother's instinct flooding every thought as I clutched Lena and ran after him down the hallway lit by strobing red emergency lights, another guard opening a rear hatch that led us into the underground bunker built beneath the house, where Diana stood with 2 others I did not know, barking orders into a radio, her eyes cutting through the room like sharp steel, and though the bunker was secure, the smell of smoke still slipped in as a reminder that above us something was burning. And I grabbed Diana's arm, asking which penthouse, whether it was Julian's, and she nodded quickly, saying they had found his location, that someone inside might have been exposed. And when I asked where he was, she said he was still in the building and refusing to leave because he wanted to secure documents. And when I demanded to know what documents, she said she could not tell me, her eyes showing fear for the first time. And I understood there were things larger than life at stake, and that Julian was still inside the apartment I had once called a glass cage, now a tomb if he did not escape. And then a loud explosion shook the bunker, dust falling from the ceiling as Lena clung to me silently, with a strange knowing as if she understood this time everything was different. And Diana rushed to the control panel, watching a flashing red symbol disappear, as she whispered that the fire system on the top floor had been disabled, no more control. And I let go of Lena and grabbed her arm, telling her to send someone in, that if Julian was alive they had to pull him out immediately. And she snapped that I did not understand, because they were not just burning the building, They were trying to drag him out through death, and if he died, everything collapsed. And I saw then that she was not just a loyal assistant, but a woman ready to die with the system she served. But I was not. I could not let the man who saved Lena, who built her a castle, who looked at me as if I were not invisible, die for a document. And I clenched my fists, saying if no one went, I would. And Diana barked at me that I was out of my mind. But I had already turned back to Lena when Tomas grabbed my shoulders, saying they would send people, that it would not be me. And I stared into his eyes as the screens flickered red, each second punching through me, until a smaller explosion blinked across the monitors, and the feed changed to show the rooftop where Julian, covered in soot and ash, his shirt burned at the edges, was being carried out by 2 men, and he never looked toward the camera, but I knew he was alive. And Lena whispered, "Mommy, is he going to be okay?" And I gathered her into my arms as tears fell onto her soft yellow hair, whispering that he would be fine, he would be fine, though I knew the fire had not only consumed the penthouse but had burned away the last barrier between me and Julian Rios's world, because from this moment on I was no longer someone on the outside, and that fire was only the first warning. I sat in silence within the emergency bunker, holding Lena close as the final steel door was lifted, and a thin stream of light from the hallway flooded in, carrying with it the harsh smell of smoke and burned dust lingering in the air. And Julian was brought in first, unsteady on his feet yet still sharp-eyed, refusing to let even the faintest hint of weakness show. His face streaked with soot, his lips cracked, and along the right side of his cheek, a long cut glistening where shattered glass had sliced him. But he was alive, and somehow still unmistakably the Julian Rios I knew, unyielding, relentless, dangerous in his quiet way. And I rose without waiting for permission, running toward him as he stopped, as though only then realizing I was there, and he looked at me for a long moment before giving the slightest nod, his hand resting, briefly and firmly on my shoulder, saying nothing, though his eyes spoke the truth clearly. He had returned, but the cost had been steep. Diana entered last, her neat bun now undone, her face pale, though her gaze remained as controlled as ever, and she said we needed to leave immediately, that the safe house had been watched for the past 24 hours, and the fire at the penthouse had been only a distraction. And I watched Julian still for a heartbeat before signaling to Tomas to activate the second escape route. No vehicles, down to the tunnels, and I had never heard him give orders before, but the moment his voice cut through the room, everything shifted into motion. Tomas and the others lifting a steel hatch in the floor that revealed a narrow passage leading underground, and Lena clung tightly to me as I followed Julian down the metal steps, the smell of damp earth and cold stone rising up to meet us, making me shiver. The tunnel cramped and low-ceilinged with dim lights, flickering against the rock walls, and I did not know where we were going, only that someone had built this place long ago with a single intention: survival. The echo of footsteps behind us mixed with the pounding of my own heartbeat and with Lena's quickened breathing against my shoulder. And after more than 10 minutes, we reached a small junction where Julian unlocked a door with a code impossibly long, revealing a room that looked like a hidden transfer station stocked with backpacks, water, flashlights, forged passports, and a detailed map. He handed me a small piece of paper, telling me that if he could not make it out, I had to go on, that following the map would lead to a vehicle waiting at the end, one that would take me and Lena out of the city, all the way to New Hampshire. And I shook my head, gripping the paper, telling him he would not stay behind, that he could not, and he looked at me with a silence that stretched like an entire century, saying he would not leave us, but if something happened, he needed me to live, needed Lena to live. And as I looked at him, it felt as if the whole world were moving while I stood still. I told him I was not the strong woman he believed I was, only a mother trying desperately to keep her child from harm, and he lifted his hand to brush away a smear of ash from my cheek, saying he was a man willing to burn an entire city down to keep the 2 of us alive, that people like us had no choice except to move forward. And then Diana appeared at the doorway, signaling that the intruders had reached the lower levels, time almost gone, and Julian ordered everyone ahead, saying he would cover the rear. I wanted to protest, but one look at him told me no one would change his mind, and I gathered Lena and ran with the others down the final corridor, each step ringing with 1,000 questions unspoken, 1,000 words unsaid, while behind us came the metallic crash of weapons and the heavy stomp of boots on concrete, a storm, closing in. When we reached the last exit, the sky opened in front of us like a miracle, A black SUV idling in the shadows with its engine humming like the heartbeat of someone refusing to die. And I turned back toward the tunnel where Julian still had not appeared. But I could not go back because Lena was in my arms and survival demanded forward motion. And as the door slammed shut behind us, I did not know whether I had just lost him or saved him in the only way available to me. The vehicle sped into the night, leaving behind a burning corner of the city and a breaking piece of my own heart. By the time we reached a small town on the outskirts of New Hampshire, dawn was lifting itself over the treetops, letting in the crisp breath of early winter through the cracked window. The scent of pine and cold mist, easing the tightness in my chest. After days drenched in the smoke and gunfire of a city filled with names I barely understood, yet had already learned to fear. Lena slept in my lap, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, her little hand gripping my sweater as if afraid I might disappear if she loosened her hold. And the SUV stopped before a 2-story wooden house set deep among the trees, its moss-covered roof and lace-curtained windows giving it the softness of a forgotten postcard, the old porch swing creaking gently in the breeze. A woman stood waiting, small in stature with silver-streaked hair pinned neatly at her nape, her sharp yet kind eyes taking in both me and the sleeping child in my arms, and I recognized the name from Julian's note. Olivia. She stepped closer, studying Lena before saying the child would be safe here, and that I would be too, at least for the moment. And I nodded, though my heart struggled to believe that anything in my life could truly be quiet again. Olivia led us inside, where the warm scent of toasted bread and hot tea wrapped around us like a tender embrace, and she brought us to the attic room where a window looked out over the valley of pine, the bed covered in a wool blanket, children's books lined up neatly, and an old painting of the sea hanging above the headboard. I did not ask Olivia about her past, but that night, after Lena had fallen asleep and I sat drinking tea with her in the warm glow of the living room, she began speaking without my prompting. She told me she had once been an army nurse and that she had met Julian when he was 18, during a relief program at the southern border, that he had been different from other boys, quiet, observant, fiercely protective of anyone weaker than himself, and that one day he had carried in a gravely injured child wounded by a homemade explosive, a child no one dared to touch, and Julian had bandaged the wounds and walked 10 kilometers with the child on his back, waiting outside the clinic for 6 hours. When she asked him why he had done it, he simply said, "Because no one else would." Olivia paused, her gaze drifting into memories of the boy he once was, and then she told me how she had later moved east to open a private clinic for immigrant families, a place Julian protected fiercely, sending people to guard it so no one could threaten it, that he believed in no government yet kept his promises with relentless loyalty, surviving by a mixture of ruthlessness toward enemies and devotion to those he trusted. I asked if she trusted him, and Olivia looked at me with eyes deep as an old well, saying she did, though she was not blind, that she knew Julian had done things she could never forgive, yet she also knew that if he ever had a chance to save himself, that chance was me. I fell silent, unsure what to feel, because I was no savior, only a mother who acted on instinct for a fleeting second, but perhaps that instant had shifted the path of a man who seemed immovable. Olivia rose to pour more tea, then sat again, saying Julian would not stop until the one behind the attack was erased, but that I needed to prepare myself because the enemy did not only want him, they wanted me, that I was no longer an invisible woman. I watched the fire dancing in the hearth, knowing she was right, and realizing I was no longer afraid of that truth. Lena remained the reason I stayed alive, but Julian, in some unspoken way, had become the reason I was ready to fight. I did not know what future awaited us, but that night in the warm wooden house tucked deep in the forest, I knew one thing with certainty. There was no turning back now, and I no longer wished to. 2 days later, Julian appeared at the door of the wooden house before the sun had risen over the tree line, and I heard the vehicle stop at a distance. The familiar weight of footsteps crossing the weathered porch boards, then 3 short knocks and 1 long one, and Lena was still asleep while Olivia was making tea in the kitchen, and when I opened the door, my heartbeat thudded the same way it had the first time. I watched him walk out of the smoke and ruin of the burning penthouse. Julian looked different, not because of the injuries that had been carefully dressed, but because of his eyes. Something deeper lived there now, something heavier, as if the past days had stripped away the last mask he had ever worn. He said nothing when I opened the door, only looked at me in a long, quiet moment before stepping inside when I gave a small nod. Olivia set out 2 cups of tea and slipped away, leaving just the 2 of us with the soft crackle of the fire filling the silence. He sat across from me, his fingers laced, his eyes never leaving mine for even a second, and he said he should begin with an apology for pulling me and Lena into all of this. But I shook my head, telling him that even if I had not stepped in front of the bullet that day, he would still have been hunted. That Lena and I were only 2 pieces that happened to fall onto a chessboard arranged long before we stumbled into it. Julian gave a faint smile, not of amusement but of reluctant acknowledgement, and then he reached into his pocket and placed a thick envelope on the table. When I asked what was inside, he said it was an opportunity, and I opened it to find documents tucked neatly inside: new passports, new identification cards, a new birth certificate for Lena, all bearing entirely new names, along with plane tickets, the address of a house in Portugal, and a bank account already opened. I looked up at him, shock widening my eyes, and asked whether he intended to send us away, and Julian nodded, saying that if I agreed, he could have me and Lena out of the United States within 24 hours, that everything had been arranged and no one would be able to trace us, that the house was mine and no one would ever reach for us again. I held the packet in my hands, my heart pounding so hard it felt as if it might tear itself free, and a part of me wanted to nod immediately, wanted to take Lena and vanish from the war closing in around us, wanted to live quietly, without flinching at every unfamiliar sound outside a door. But another part, one I had not realized had grown so strong, did not want to leave. I placed the papers on the table and asked him why he was doing this, why he was not trying to keep me, because he had the power to do so. And Julian looked at me with a kind of rare sincerity I had never seen in him before, saying he did not keep the people he cared about by caging them, saying he had once lost everything and knew the shame of someone suffering because of him, saying he did not want that for me. I drew a deep breath and reminded him that he once told me some debts could not be repaid with money, and asked what that meant for my debt to him, and he was silent before saying that if he told me I owed him nothing, would I believe it? And when I shook my head, I realized I did not want to believe it, perhaps because I no longer wanted to leave. I told him that if I ran now, I would spend the rest of my life running, and Lena would grow up with a mother who taught her to fear the world, and that I could not live that way. And he looked at me for a long time before nodding, as though he had already known my answer but still needed to hear it from my own mouth. He said that if I stayed, I would no longer stand on the edges, and I nodded, telling him I understood and I was ready, because Lena was the reason I lived, but he was becoming the reason I no longer feared living. Julian bowed his head, his hands tightening, and when he looked up I saw in his eyes a promise that needed no words, no signature, a silent vow that from this moment on he would not leave me to face anything alone. And by choosing not to flee that morning, I stepped another shade, deeper into his world, a place where safety was a luxury but truth and feeling had never been sharper. Our second dinner did not take place in a luxurious apartment with expensive wine or crisp white linens or candlelight glinting off crystal. It happened in Olivia's warm wooden kitchen, with stew simmered since morning and toasted bread still warm to the touch, and Lena sat at the table with her mouth full of soup and a smear of tomato sauce on her cheek, telling Julian about the singing doll Olivia had found in the attic, while Julian simply listened with a small smile, sometimes nodding, even wincing once when she asked whether he was afraid of needles. The air was so light I nearly forgot that the man across from me was a name whispered with fear throughout the city. When dinner ended, Olivia took Lena upstairs, leaving Julian and me alone at a table mostly cleared except for 2 steaming cups of tea and the soft glow of the old lamp overhead. I rested my hand on the table, quiet for a long moment before asking him to tell me the real reason everything had begun, why I had been pulled in, why Lena had nearly died in a war I had never even known existed. Julian leaned back, his eyes lowering toward his cup, and for the first time I saw him, without absolute control, and when he finally looked at me, his voice carried a weight I never imagined hearing from him. He told me the man behind the attack was Victor Lang, once an ally and now a traitor, a man whose name I had heard from customers at the restaurant, a weapons trafficker with charities used as fronts, and a network filthier than any local government. And Julian said Victor had once worked for him, that he had helped Victor launder money in exchange for information and power. But Victor wanted more. He wanted Julian, wanted his entire system, and when Julian refused, Victor began breaking it from the inside. One of Victor's men had infiltrated Julian's inner circle and had leaked Lena's medical records, And I felt numb, realizing that the documents I thought were locked away, the diagnoses, treatments, the entire hospital history of my daughter had been delivered into the hands of men who did not even know her name. And Julian said Victor used those records as leverage, believing Julian would kneel when a child was pushed toward the brink, but Julian had not. He lifted his eyes, and they looked like cooled ash, telling me he once believed he could control everything if he were ruthless and clever enough, that the world would hold still beneath his feet. And then I appeared, not as a threat but as a shard of glass slamming into the wall he had spent years constructing. I listened as though each word peeled back layers I once thought impenetrable, and he told me I was not the first Victor had targeted, but I was the first to stand in his way, and that I had done it with no weapon, no power, only a foolish decision made in the rain, a decision that had changed everything. When he asked what I thought he was, I told him I once believed he was a monster in a suit, but now I believed he was a man trying to become something better, and he did not deny it, saying I was not just a single mother, but the reason he was sitting there, not because of any debt, but because I made him want to end this war once and for all. My hands tightened around the warm cup as I told him that if he was going to finish this, I wanted to know, I wanted to be part of it, and he shook his head, saying I had a daughter to protect. And I told him I understood because I had once had a family too and knew that once you were dragged into something like this, silence was no longer an option, that I no longer wanted the seat in the back. Julian looked at me for a long time before finally nodding, saying that we would need a plan, that he would show me the real face of Victor, and that together we would make sure he would never touch anyone again. And in the quiet light of that wooden kitchen, with the sound of insects drifting in from the forest and the faint taste of tea lingering on my lips, I realized that the second dinner was not just a meal, it was the true beginning, and for the first time, in a world built on lies and violence, I was hearing a truth that did not hide. The next morning, when I woke, Julian was already in the kitchen with Olivia, his dress shirt sleeves rolled up as he clumsily chopped carrots, while Lena stood beside him giving stern instructions as if she were the head chef, and the sight of them made me pause at the doorway for a few seconds. Not out of surprise, but because an unexpected gentleness rose inside me, the kind I once believed I no longer had the right to feel. We ate breakfast together, and no one mentioned Victor Lang or the burns still carved into memory. But when Lena and Olivia went upstairs, Julian turned to me with the familiar seriousness in his eyes and said he would take me somewhere, offering no explanation beyond a small nod and a reminder to bring a coat. We drove through winding mountain roads, deeper into the northern woods where phone signals faded into nothing, and when the vehicle finally stopped, a small wooden cabin rested in the valley ahead, its roof covered in dry leaves, its walls aged and moss-stained as though untouched for years. Julian opened the door, and a damp, musty smell drifted out, not unpleasant but like an old memory unsealed after too long, and he led me down a narrow hallway into a room filled with maps, files, and photographs, all of them about Victor Lang. One entire wall was covered with images, notes, and connecting lines, and at the center was a picture of a boy around 12, standing beside a woman in medical scrubs. I recognized Olivia, and the boy was Julian. "This is where I began," he said, his voice deep and worn like the beams of the old cabin. After his mother died, he lived here with his foster father, a former police officer forced out for being too honest with his superiors, a man who taught him to read people, read danger, and above all survive, until he was murdered for exposing a politician tied to human trafficking. And from that day on, Julian trusted no one but himself. He stepped closer to the board and touched a photo of a silver-haired man with cold, dead eyes, saying Victor Lang was the first to pull him into the underworld, the man who gave him money and power, and waited for the day he would return payment with his soul. And when Julian refused to keep washing Victor's blood, Victor chose another path, tearing down everything Julian built and destroying anyone he cared about, including me and Lena. I stepped closer, studying every photo and note Julian had spent years gathering, and I understood why he could not back away, and why I could no longer stand apart either. But amid all that ugliness, one question kept circling in my mind, and I asked him softly but firmly what the line was between him and Victor, between what he had done and what Victor was doing. How I could know he would not someday become the very thing he despised. Julian looked at me a long time, without flinching or defending himself, and he said, "Because I have you. Without you, I would not ask myself that question, every day." Without you, I would have no reason to distinguish between surviving and doing what is right. You are my line, Maya. I clenched my hands, feeling the cold of the wooden floor through my shoes, and told him I did not want to be anyone's moral boundary or the reason someone lived better, that if I chose to stand with him, it must not be from guilt or debt, but because I believed in him. And Julian stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder, his gaze softening, telling me not to believe his words but to look at how he protected me and Lena, to look at what he was about to do to end this, and that if I ever saw him cross that line, I should be the first to stop him. And he swore he would. In the silence of the forest cabin, surrounded by the blood-stained past and the uncertain future, I did not answer aloud, but I remained where I was instead of turning away, and perhaps that was the answer. When we returned from the cabin, the sky had darkened with gray clouds, and the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves clung to the air like a warning, and Olivia stood on the porch holding a small piece of paper, her expression unchanged but her eyes heavy with worry. Someone had left it at the door with no sound, no tracks. Julian unfolded it, reading the messy red-inked scrawl. This time, we will not only burn the house. He crushed the paper instinctively, and my heart dropped as I realized the peace here had only been an illusion. Victor Lang had found us, stepping out of the shadows at last. That evening, Julian called Tomas and Diana, and the house filled with footsteps and hurried voices, communication equipment humming, maps spread over the dining table with red markers like open wounds. Olivia took Lena to the vetted neighbor's home, while Julian and I sat in the makeshift operations room he had turned the living room into. Diana reported remotely that a hired armed group not officially tied to Victor but tracing our movements exactly was approaching town and could arrive within 12 hours. Julian did not blink, saying we had no time to wait and that Lena had to be moved immediately. I protested, saying she would panic if separated from me again, and he answered calmly that these men would not hesitate to fire and he would not risk Lena in this war. And I knew he was right, though my heart refused to listen. He pulled out another map showing an underground tunnel leading from the house to an abandoned barn nearly 2 miles away, explaining that Tomas would meet Olivia and Lena with a vehicle at the far end and take them to a safe station in Vermont, where they would have the option to leave the country if needed. I clenched my fists and asked what he would do, and Julian gave a small half-smile instead of a direct answer, saying he would stay because he had no choice, because this was his war, but that this time he was not fighting to protect an empire but to keep me alive, and his voice carried a raw truth no strategy could hide. I nodded, knowing time was slipping through our fingers. Lena sat wide-eyed when I entered her room, asking if we were leaving again, and I knelt beside her, wrapping my arms around her small shoulders, telling her it would only be for a few days and that I would come for her soon, and she nodded though her lips trembled. I kissed her forehead and held her tight, the childlike scent of her shampoo breaking something inside my chest. That night, under the whispering rain, Lena and Olivia descended into the tunnel with Diana inspecting each step, while Tomas led the way, and Julian and I stood on the porch watching distant lights blink like predatory eyes in the dark. I asked him what our chances were, and he answered without hesitation that without me, they had 60%. But with me here, he did not dare calculate. And when I turned to him, he wore a faint smile, half teasing and half painfully honest, and I laughed, the sound rising into the wet night like the last weapon we had against fear. "Then what are you waiting for?" I said. "Begin." Julian nodded, pulling the pistol from his coat and checking the rounds one last time. No longer the phantom haunting skyscraper shadows, but a man standing in front of his own doorway, preparing to face a former friend turned monster. I stepped back inside, lifted the radio, and listened as Tomas confirmed a safe arrival at the transfer point. Lena was far away now. It was only us, the house, and the approaching footsteps growing closer by the minute. The war had reached our doorstep. And this time, I was not stepping back. Night rain drummed against the roof like a slow countdown, each minute stretching thin inside the dimly lit room, as the quiet tension between Julian and me settled into the walls like breath held too long. He remained by the window, eyes fixed on the dark line of trees where the hired men would soon appear, while Diana stayed in the basement checking the communication lines, and I stood at the table, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed over the folder Julian had left on the wooden surface. Inside was everything we had on Victor Lang: Swiss bank accounts, records of bribed officials, proof of his links to an international trafficking network. If this reached the press, part of his empire would collapse. But not enough. He knew how to slip past the media. He had buried countless victims beneath piles of nameless paperwork. I understood that if we wanted to bring him down, we could not strike from afar. We had to get close, and I was the one person he had not prepared for. I turned to Julian with my mind already made. "Let me go." Julian looked at me, a faint crease forming between his brows. "Go where?" "Into his center. He wants me to be your weakness. Let me be his blind spot. I will go to him, bring a copy of the files, lure him in. If I succeed, he will reveal himself. If I fail, at least I drag him away from here." Julian stepped forward, gripping my shoulders, his eyes deep as the night itself. "You think this is a film, Maya. You think he will let you live once you walk in. You are a mother. You are the reason we are still standing." I placed my hand over his, tightening my grip. "And because I am a mother, I know what sacrifices matter. And because I am the woman who loves you, I cannot stand back while you fall, not when I still have a chance to do something." Julian froze, my words cutting through his armor like a bullet without leaving a wound, but forcing every defense he had to crack. A long silence hung between us. Then he nodded, barely. "If you go, Tomas goes with you. I will not let you face him alone. But Maya, you must promise to pull back when necessary. Do nothing unless you have my signal." I nodded. From this moment on, I am the Maya he does not know. I changed clothes, left behind anything identifiable, and carried an encrypted copy of the USB with information powerful enough to rattle an entire system. Diana handed me a small earpiece hidden in the button of my shirt, her voice steady as early fog. "You have 3 hours. After that, everything shifts to Plan B." I walked to the car with Tomas as the rain grew heavier, the road slick like it had been glazed in ice. The car stopped at an abandoned warehouse Victor used as a transit point for shipments. No guards, no traps, but I knew the silence itself was the largest trap of all. We stepped inside, and Tomas's voice came through the earpiece. "All channels open. We are 2 minutes away, 1 call from reaching you." Only a single, weak yellow bulb flickered overhead, and Victor Lang stood in the center of the room. Long coat, a glass of liquor in his hand as though he were greeting an expected guest. He looked at me without smiling. "You are the one I cannot predict. That is why I agreed to meet." I walked closer, every step measured. "I bring an offer. My life in exchange for Julian's permanent silence." He raised a brow and laughed, softly. "Your life holds what value?" I pulled the USB from my pocket and lifted it. "If I do not return in 3 hours, this will be released. All of it. Every dollar. Every secret you buried." He went still, studying me like deciding whether to kill me where I stood, and in that instant I knew I had stepped into the only fracture in his armor. I, a mother, an outsider, had done what Julian's entire world could not. I made Victor Lang hesitate. And sometimes, hesitation is the beginning of a collapse. Victor remained motionless, his stare slicing through me as if searching for something he had not yet named. The glass stayed in his hand, untouched, the lone bulb casting a pale shimmer across the thick gold ring on his left middle finger. At last he set the glass down and took one slow step toward me, unhurried, as if he truly believed he still held every thread of control. "You know, Maya, I once believed Julian was unshakable. The way he watched a man tortured without blinking. The way he ordered the disposal of a former friend for a single act of betrayal convinced me he was the only one who could build the final empire with me. Then you arrived. And he began to hesitate. He began to choose loyalty. He began to grow weak. I said nothing, gripping the USB as if it were the last piece of my life. I did not come to speak about Julian. I came to offer you a choice. You disappear, withdraw from everything, bury your name forever, and let me live, or you kill me, knowing this will reach every major media channel within 10 minutes of my signal cutting off." Victor laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "You think I have not faced ultimatums. I have lived my life in rooms without windows, Maya. But no one has ever placed truth on the table the way you just did. I knew I was gambling, not with a sure card, but with the only card I had, myself, and the hope that even a man like Victor Lang feared losing one thing above all control." He circled me like a cat studying a cornered mouse. "You love him, do you not?" he asked. his voice soft as breath but sharp as a blade. I turned to meet his stare. Yes. And that is why I am willing to die if it means he lives. Silence fell heavy, thick as a curtain. Victor stopped behind me, close enough that I could hear his breath, cold and steady. Then, instead of giving an order, he returned to the table, lifted the glass, and drank it empty. Go, and tell Julian this is the last time I forgive a debt without a ledger. Next time, I will collect in blood. I did not wait another second. I stepped out of the warehouse, my legs steady even as my heart refused to believe I had just walked away alive. Tomas stood beside the vehicle, tension carved into his expression. I only nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. As the car moved down the forest road, I finally loosened my grip and exhaled like someone breaking the surface after a breath held too long. When we reached the house, Julian was waiting on the porch, rain soaking him through as if he had not left that spot for hours. I ran to him, saying nothing, only wrapping my arms around him and feeling the urgent beat of his heart against mine. I did it, I whispered. And for the first time since this began, I saw something break open in Julian's eyes. Not fear, not anger, but relief. You could have died, he murmured, but I did not. I came back. I chose to come back. I stepped away, placed my hand on his cheek. I am not a debt, Julian. I am a choice. And today, I chose you. Not out of obligation, not from fear, but because I believe that after all the shadows, there is still a part of you that knows how to hold on to what is right. And for the first time, Julian did not answer with words. He only held me, arms locked tight as if in that single moment he finally allowed himself to believe he was someone worth saving. 1 week after I walked out of that warehouse with my life still intact, the name Victor Lang was splashed across every television screen in America as he was arrested at a private airport not even 20 minutes from New York. The news spread like fire through dry brush as major networks reported the same headline. The underground financial kingpin charged with more than 23 counts. From money laundering and human trafficking to collusion with terrorist organizations, his image handcuffed, his face cold and unreadable flashed across countless screens, the visual symbol of a toppled empire. But what no one else knew was that the FBI had not brought him down. No specialized task force had reopened old files or dug into his financial web. It was Julian who sent the encrypted dossier to 2 of Victor's former allies, along with a simple message: cooperate or go down with him. They chose survival. And the rest fell like a string of dominoes collapsing faster than anyone could predict. I stood beside Julian in Olivia's warm living room, the television silently rolling a final headline: The Lang Empire has officially fallen. Julian said nothing, but I noticed the faint twitch in his fingers, a reaction too instinctive to hide. I knew this wasn't merely victory for him. It was the end of a life he had lived for so long that he no longer knew who he was without it. I stepped closer and rested my hand on his shoulder. He kept his eyes on the screen as he said, his voice low and almost hoarse. He was someone I trusted once. I thought if anyone understood how this world worked, it was him. And then, day by day, I realized he wasn't navigating the world, he was devouring it. I nodded, gently tightening my hold on him. Then what about you, Julian? When the monster is gone, who does that make you? He turned toward me, and the sharpness in his eyes had softened, deepened, become human again. I think I want to learn how to be a person again, he whispered. Maybe not a perfect one, but at least one who doesn't need to kill to survive. We didn't celebrate. No, champagne popped. No triumphant phone calls. Because what had been lost could never be counted. Lives broken, memories twisted, wounds no one could see. The next day, Julian drove me and Lena away from the cabin, no longer in fear or haste. We followed the winding road through the forest, the car moving slowly as if reluctant to leave the quiet behind. Lena slept in the back seat, clutching the singing doll Olivia had given her. I sat beside Julian, feeling a strange, almost fragile lightness. Not because everything was suddenly good, but because, for the first time, the road ahead looked like a road, not a cliff. Julian stopped the car at a ridge overlooking a valley. He turned off the engine and stepped outside. I followed him. The wind carried the scent of pine and dry grass. He handed me a small memory card containing the final copy of everything we had on Victor Lang. Then he placed a lighter in my palm. Burn it. I looked at him. Are you sure? He nodded. No one needs to remember this anymore, not because we are hiding from it, but because we deserve a beginning not dragged down by shadows. I lit the flame and watched the card curl into ash in my hand, the tiny red embers falling to the ground before the wind swept them away. When I looked back at Julian, he stood quiet, no longer a ruler, no longer a man burdened by the world he once held up, just a man, learning to love, to release, and to start again. And I knew then we did not need a perfect beginning. We only needed each other, and a path to keep walking. Every debt had been paid. Every choice had been made. And Victor Lang, whose name once shook the entire underworld, was nothing more than dust scattered among the trees. After all that had happened, after gunfire and tears, the night chases, the threats, and the silent sacrifices, what remained was not triumph but peace. Not a peace born from forgetting, but from learning to live beside the past without letting it consume us. A few months after Victor's arrest and the collapse of everything he built, Julian, Lena, and I moved to a small lakeside town where no one knew our real names or cared who we used to be. Julian opened a small woodworking shop, a trade that had nothing to do with power or control, and each time he ran his hand along a smooth piece of sanded oak, something in him settled, softened. I took a part-time job at a community center, telling stories to children who didn't have access to preschool. Lena made friends quickly. She laughed more, slept deeper, and sometimes even padded into the kitchen at night for water without needing to turn on the lights. We didn't speak about our past every day, but we didn't bury it either. Some evenings, after Lena had fallen asleep, Julian and I sat on the porch watching the moon shimmer across the lake as we shared the fears we had once hidden. Each story was a fragment of the long journey from sheer survival toward truly living, and that is what I want to share with you today, that sometimes the greatest strength is not rising after every fall, but choosing to let go of the things you once believed you needed to survive. That forgiveness is not for the person who hurt you, but for the part of you still trapped in the pain. That love begins not with promises, but with small, steady acts of showing up each day. And most importantly, that no matter how dark the past has been, you always retain the right to rewrite your life. The story you've just listened to is not simply a battle against darkness, but a journey toward rediscovering oneself, toward finding a life simple yet meaningful. And now, I would like to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? In your own life, have you ever found yourself merely trying to survive instead of truly living? If so, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would be honored to hear your genuine reflections from the deepest part of your heart. If you found this story meaningful, please remember to like, subscribe to our channel, and share the video so it can reach others who might need a spark of hope or a quiet moment of clarity amid the noise of everyday life. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we will continue bringing heartfelt stories, deep lessons, and honest glimpses of this beautifully complex world. Wishing you good health, joyful days, and the peace that comes from within. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.